Thank you very much, colleagues, and it's a pleasure to see you all in the room. And it's also my pleasure to also join this workshop this morning, focusing on food and ecological security, such an important topic, but more so looking at the role of the public and private sector in supporting ecosystem resilience. We are meeting here in Jeju under the banner of the World Conservation Congress, which has brought all of us together. We know it's one of the world's largest, most important conservation event, bringing not only top professionals from all regions, but expertise to share knowledge on how our natural environment can be managed for the continued well-being of humanity and all life on Earth. Today we are convened here to discuss nature-based solutions to food security. The World Food Summit of 1996 defined food security as it exists when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. Commonly, the concept of food security is equally defined to include both physical and economic access to food that meets people's dietary needs as well as their food preferences. In many countries, health problems related to dietary access are an ever-increasing threat. In fact, malnutrition and foodborne diarrhea are becoming a double burden. Food security is a complex, sustainable development issue linked to health through malnutrition, but also to sustainable economic development, environment, as well as trade. As highlighted in one of our flagship assessment report, Global Environmental Outlook, the 5th edition, in which it underlines, in order to reduce the proportion of developing countries' populations that are chronically undernourished, world food production will need to increase. Although food consumption per person is increasing across all regions, it is unevenly distributed, and the number of malnourished people continues to rise. The recent report of the Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability puts forth that by 2030, the world will need at least 50% more food than what we have today, 45% more energy, and 30% more water, all at a time when environmental boundaries are throwing up new limits to supply. Loss of biodiversity, degradation of ecosystems all undermines health, livelihood, food production, and availability of clean water. What grows in the wild is just as important as what grows on our farms. Food security usually is built on 3 pillars, namely food availability. Basically, we need sufficient quantities of food available on a consistent basis. Secondly, food access, having sufficient resources to obtain appropriate food for a nutritious diet. And thirdly, food utilization or food use, meaning appropriate use based on knowledge of basic nutrition and care, as well as adequate water and sanitation. The debate on food security so far has largely revolved around these 3 pillars: availability, access, and utilization, barely touching on the resource base and ecosystem services that prop up the whole food system. Ladies and gentlemen, the linkage between biodiversity, water, and food security is important to recognize as humans consume thousands of different species of plants and animals. It will be challenging to meet future global demands for food while avoiding or at least mitigating negative impacts on forests, wetlands, and other ecosystems, and at the same time reducing poverty, supporting livelihood, and ensuring food safety and animal welfare. There is little debate that more land will have to be allocated to agriculture, but this will not equally be sufficient without increasing yields and reducing losses along the food supply chain. Again, UNEP in its new report entitled Avoiding Future Famines, Strengthening the Ecological Basis of Food Security through Sustainable Food Systems, finds that food security must embrace the environmental services that nature provides if the world is to feed its 7 billion inhabitants. The world urgently needs to focus on maintaining and boosting the underlying ecological foundations that support food production, which face growing threats from human activity, to help ensure food security for a growing population. Ecosystems and ecosystem services critically determine various aspects of human well-being. Ecosystem services like water, food, and energy are also the backbone of economies, but their contribution remain by and large invisible in the national profit and loss accounts. There are often trade-offs among various users of ecosystems. Coastal wetlands can provide land for housing and recreation and can also provide for shrimp farms. Woodlands in Africa can become fields of maize or remain as they are to harvest the ecological services. In the drive to address food security, there is lack of understanding among policymakers that for many people, especially more than 70% in less developed rural areas, wild sources of food form an integral part of people's diet. Limited attention has been given by decision makers in discerning the role of healthy ecosystems in producing sustainable livelihood and the importance of environmental governance in empowering the poor. UNEP, on its side, has been emphasizing the mainstreaming of ecosystem services into physical, monetary, trade, and investment policy of countries. One of the flagship projects of UNEP in the field of project and ecosystem services. This project intends to provide such tools as accounting and evaluation in the partner countries, in particular in Chile, Trinidad and Tobago, South Africa, Lesotho, and Vietnam, to enable decision makers be tempted to use them to align their goals of development, food security, poverty eradication, and conservation. UNEP feels we need to link ecosystem management with larger macroeconomic policies and planning of nations. Some of the ongoing projects include trade-offs and trade-off analysis between food security and ecosystem services in India and Cuba. These projects focus on indication of key ecosystem services affected by intensive agricultural production practices intrinsic to food security and carrying out activities to analyze the trade-offs of food production and conditions of ecosystem services. UNEP continues to strengthen its collaboration with Food Agricultural Organization, International Food and Agricultural Development, IFAD, World Bank, World Food Program, as well as SIGARA to catalyze a more focused analysis of the various land use goals, optimize agriculture and land use decisions for multiple objectives, and consolidate well-accepted data and evidence in order to enhance the ecological basis of agricultural production. Building on this, UNEP continues to organize workshops and conferences to create an international forum of championing discussions, learning, and designing actions to scale up sustainable landscape planning and management. Under this initiative, UNEP, as I indicated earlier on, has published a high-level scientific assessment on avoiding the next famine, strengthening the ecological basis of food security. Ladies and gentlemen, new policy tools that recognize ecological basis of food systems should be developed for a clear way forward to shore up the ecological foundations and improve food security. New policies should guide the redesign of sustainable agricultural systems, dietary changes, and storage systems, including new food standards to reduce waste. A quarter of a century ago, the Brundtland report introduced the concept of sustainable development as a new paradigm for economic growth, social equality, and environmental sustainability. Yet, while the concept has been well embraced, we have yet to translate it into reality. But for too many of us, the problem is not unsustainable choices, but a lack of choices in the first place. And this is especially true for the challenge of food security. The outcome document of the recently ended Rio Summit in June this year, or the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, reinforced the global commitment to tackle food security challenges, all of us together. The outcome document of that Rio Summit is a solid foundation for which to build on food security. Our leaders have reaffirmed their commitment regarding the right of everyone to have access to safe, sufficient, nutritious food consistent with the right to adequate food and fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. Furthermore, the outcome document acknowledges that green economy will enhance countries' ability to manage natural resources sustainably with the lower negative environmental impacts. The outcome stresses the necessity to promote, enhance, and support more sustainable agriculture, including crops, livestock, forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture that improves food security, eradicates hunger, and is economically viable while conserving the land, water, plant, and animal genetic resources, biodiversity, ecosystem, as well as enhancing resilience to climate change and natural disasters. The outcome document also recognizes the need to maintain natural ecological processes that support food production systems. A transition to green economy can therefore assist us in fast-tracking food security, and we at UNEP look forward to working with all of you to find these nature-based solutions to food security. Thank you very much.
Ms. Mreman, thanks for your speech. What I noted from your speech is that loss of biodiversity and degradation of ecosystems is critical for livelihoods and food production. The bundle of ecosystem services is another pillar of the concept of food security. And policymakers need to pay more attention in the role of healthy ecosystems in providing sustainable livelihoods. And finally, we are really glad to hear about UNEP's initiatives and projects about the linkages between food security and ecosystem services. Let me now turn to our panel. Our first panelist is Ms. Amita Shah, Director of Gujarat Institute of Development Research. She will make a presentation on structural impediments to food and ecological security. Ms. Amita Shah is an economist, and she has wide-ranging experience of conducting research on various aspects of rural economy. More recently, she has been involved in a number of studies pertaining to participatory watershed development, protected area management, economic valuation of biodiversity, chronic poverty in remote rural areas, migration and status of women in agriculture, and she has published about 40 research papers in professional journals and books, and participated in a number of academic seminars as well. Ms. Amita Shah, please. Yes. You just need to click your name. And then F5. Yes. While you're reaching your presentation, I would like to ask you two main questions. Why haven't we yet been able to feed all without damaging the natural assets? And secondly, what tools and incentives under food security policies can be used so that ecosystems that supply us with essential services protected?
Good morning, and let me at the outset thank UNEP for giving me this opportunity to present some of my thoughts. Let me also say that what I'm going to share with you is some kind of a very broad brush of reflection on this very, very important and very engaging theme on food and ecological security on a fairly large canvas. When I say fairly large canvas is I'm going to kind of think little globally and then cull out a few important elements which focus on the central question of long-term food security, which essentially would also include the concerns about ecological security. In the limited time that I have, I will quickly go through the presentation and then invite some reactions or comments from the audience. Let me say that some of the basic statements which can be easily made based on the evidence and estimates which we have from the global literature, especially from the FAO literature. I mean, it's good to start with a very positive note that if we look at the projections for 2030 or 2050, there are estimates as of now which assure us that under certain circumstances there would be actually a possibility of producing enough food to feed the growing population by 2030 or 2050. So that's a fairly good and positive note with which one can start thinking about food security, because the problems then come from somewhere else. This actually, a positive projection is based on two basic assumptions. One is it assumes the more or less the knowledge about the state-of-the-art technology for food production, and it would also require a significant intensification of agriculture. This is actually not a very good news, because both these obviously lead to the kind of trade-offs which the previous speakers have already talked about. If we think of the state-of-the-art technology for producing food under different ecosystems and intensification of cultivation and crop production, there are definitely going to be an increasing trade-off between food security and ecological security, because all the natural resources like land, water, increased chemical inputs, crop-centric approach to production, loss of biodiversity are very much integral to this twin strategy of intensification and the state-of-the-art technology. So what we need to, if we want to still produce enough food to feed everybody by 2030 or 2050, we need to change primarily three things, and this is my basic proposition. We need to change what is being produced. This implies that the commodity composition or the crop composition of the food basket does not necessarily have to remain the same as it stands now. We really need to think about changing the food basket to feed the future population in 2030 or 2050, because we also will have to try to take care of the ecological security around. The second thing is we need to also change the way food is produced. That is the technology part of it. I already mentioned about it, but basically the intensification of crop production, which is very, very crop centric, and it actually depends a lot on use of chemical inputs and fresh water, is not going to be something which is going to solve the problem for future food security. And third is the location or the geography of food production has to change. If we change all the three things in a fairly integrated, coordinated and well